Welcome to How to Tell Someone. I'm your host, Tonya Pieske. Before we get started, I encourage you to check the episode description. That's where you'll find content warnings. Guests on How to Tell Someone are sharing vulnerable, personal stories that sometimes include themes that may be difficult for some listeners, so please take care while listening. Today's story comes from Tessa.
I was born in Nevada and kind of hopped between a bunch of different West Coast states before landing in Washington. My mom left my dad and she was 23 when she divorced him, and they had been living with my dad's parents. And she was estranged from her biological parents. And so we moved in with some other family members who had like a duplex, and they had like a basement apartment that they let us stay in. And then she got a boyfriend, so we moved in with the boyfriend, and then her and the boyfriend couldn't make rent for whatever reason. So we moved in with my aunt. And then like we move into our own place again, and then she meets another guy, and then we move in with him, and then he gets a job and we move where his job is, which is kind of a funny thing to explain to people who've stayed in the same house their whole life. I had a boyfriend in high school who was like, "Why'd you move around so much? Why didn't you just stay in the same house? Wouldn't that be easier?" And I was like, yeah, if you're raised by two stable adults with stable incomes, yeah, it's easier. You know, she had me when she was really young, and so that sort of set things off as like a, babies raising babies sort of deal. And I kind of watched her grow up while I was also growing up. And so, like watching her sort of become an adult while I was being a kid still, and sort of watching her kind of come into herself in a way that other kids don't necessarily see. Like maybe their parents have them in like their 30s or 40s, and my mom was 19. And so I was, watching a woman in her 20s figure herself out while also trying to raise me and navigate relationships and all of these different things. And I think it just gave me this sort of maybe a more intimate view of who she was as a person than I think some of my peers did, having older parents that were maybe a little bit more closely guarded, or maybe they'd been in the same relationship. So you're not seeing like what happens when two adults that you're close to have a breakup or a divorce or something like that, And she also, I think because she had so much tumultuous stuff going on in her life, I kind of ended up being her sounding board sometimes when it wasn't appropriate. And so that also gave me more of an insight into sort of like what she was going through and how she was dealing with it. And some of it was maybe not technically my business as a kid. Part of me was happy that she trusted me. And then I got older and I was like, oh, that wasn't necessarily appropriate for you to be putting on me. And so, it led to like this sense of closeness, but also, I don't really know how to put it. There was like a sense of closeness, but then also just being a little bit, not necessarily hurt, but just like wishing that I hadn't had that view. Like maybe having a parent who's a little bit more stable and doesn't feel like they're leaning on you for support. It kind of influences how you view yourself and how you view your parents. And my dad wasn't the greatest at that either. He couldn't really take care of himself on a multitude of levels. And so it was sort of like, I never really felt that thing of like, these are my parents up here and I'm the kid. It was sort of like we were all mishmashed together at certain points depending on who needed what. My mom always describes me as like I was a terrible kid. Like up to a certain point, I was really bratty and I was really loud, and I just, I wanted everybody's attention all the time, and I didn't do what I was told. And I understand that now. I was a child with undiagnosed ADHD being raised by a mom with undiagnosed ADHD and a dad who also probably was undiagnosed. And so, like, yeah, I didn't have great emotional regulation. I was off in my own world a lot. I was very introverted. I did not do sports. She signed me up for soccer for 1 year, and I hated it, and I refused to go back. And so mostly I spent my time drawing and watching movies, and with my nose in a book, I would read books like they were food. Like, it was just how I survived. I was constantly reading, and if I had, during the summers, I would go to my dad's house, and my cousins and I would spend most of our time in the backyard, and we'd come up with fantasy games where it was we were princesses and all that kind of stuff. And I always wanted to come up with really elaborate storylines, based on books that I'd read and things like that. I just don't think that raising kids is her jam. She loves all of her nieces and nephews and grandbabies and all that stuff, but the day-to-day raising of kids, I think, it's overwhelming for her now as a seasoned adult. And I've seen this play out in a way that's been both frustrating and a little bit of a relief with her stepkids. Because I have seen that she's not a terribly patient person. Her biological parents were, they were not good people. They were neglectful and abusive, and obviously shouldn't have had a child around them. And so she didn't have this is how you raise a kid thing. She only had, this is how you don't raise a kid. So I can't imagine how terrifying it would have been for her as basically a teenager. She's always impressed me over the years. She's been self-employed for literally my entire life. She has ebbed out of being self-employed a couple of times, and they haven't really gone the way she wanted them to. And so she always falls back into working for herself, and she's done a remarkable job at it. Her business, because we've moved so many times that she's had to restart her business each time. And it's never taken long for her to flourish wherever we've moved. People know that she's good at what she does, and she's close with all of her clients. One of them actually performed her last marriage. She tends to get really close to people, and people enjoy being with her. She'll go to an old lady's house to do her hair because she can't get to, the salon anymore, stuff like that. So I don't know, when I see her happy and I see her at her fullest self, I want to drag people around and be look at this lady, look at how cool she is, when she's at her, at her best, and I'm seeing who she really is. And I think sometimes that gets stifled. And that's, something that I see happen in her relationships with some of these men. I think they see initially someone who's very, very pretty, which is one of those things that I guess I didn't say that when I was describing who she is, because it's sort of passive in my head. But when I think of the way men see her, it's definitely, she's very pretty. She's always been very pretty and very thin. And, my guy friends growing up had huge crushes on her. It's the worst. It's so unsettling. But yeah, I think initially they see someone who's very pretty. And I think then they initially, see her as sort of they like that she's kind of sassy and kind of opinionated. And so I think that there's this thing where then they find out that she's maybe a little bit broken, and maybe, her relationship with her parents isn't great, and things like that kind of make it easier to kind of worm in there. And I think the guys who aren't interested in doing that are not appealing to her. The ones who just view her as a whole person and not as someone they can manipulate. For some reason, she's no, thank you. I would prefer the guys who see a broken little baby bird that they can scoop up and take advantage of. There is definitely a pattern of her biological dad was an alcoholic, and my dad was an alcoholic, and her current husband is an alcoholic. And then the two in between, her first boyfriend after she divorced my dad, and then her second husband, they, to my knowledge, didn't have any drug or alcohol related issues, but they were both narcissist. And so I think really she was just sort of, I think she tends to be drawn just towards selfish people generally. I think that's just who she was used to being around growing up, was people who didn't actually care that much for her. That was, what I really observed in her growing up. And I see how she's really happy at the beginning, and then like things progress, and then she's not happy and she is just stuck. And so that's kind of been the cycle with her, has been these guys who, and that's the thing, is she actually, after she divorced her second husband, there was a period of time for maybe like a year where she was dating a lot, which was a little bit awkward for me as somebody who was like a 17-year-old still living at home. But she was like happy, kind of like just kind of bouncing around and like going on dates. And there were a few guys that she dated that I actually really liked, which was shocking because that wasn't common for us. Like that was, not a normal thing. And those ones never seemed to go anywhere. And so I'd always be like, well, what about that guy that was so nice to you? Or that, like, there was one guy who, like, he'd bring me food from their dates and, like, make sure that, like, there was food for me in the morning, even though he hadn't met me yet. Like, stuff like that was actually really tender. And, like, the kind of person who I really wanted my mom to be with. But then those would never work out. And the ones that were long-term were the ones where she was just complaining about the person all the time. It's hard to see that, and it's like I could just get over it if he was just somebody I didn't like, but she was still enjoying the relationship. Like I could move past that, because that would be a me problem. That would take away so much of my opinion of another person if she was genuinely happy. But that's been so few and far between that I don't even know what that feels like, really. Husband started dating, I think, when I was like 17 or 18. I was a little bit concerned just because the person that introduced them, his sister, I wasn't like a huge fan of her, but then I met him and I was like, oh, he seems like an okay guy. Like, he was different from the other guys my mom had dated in that he seemed like genuinely interested in me, and he seemed to actually like his own kids, which hadn't always been a thing with the other guys my mom had been with. I remember there was one time they hadn't been seeing each other very long, and my mom and I went to a concert, and we got back really late, and we went to his house because one of his other sisters had gone with us to the concert, and he made sure that I was comfy on the couch, and I was like, oh, I'm sorry, I have to crash here, and he was like, don't worry about it. Like, my mom had been sneaking me beers in the arena. I was like maybe 18. And so I was like, yeah, I need to crash here. And he was like, that's fine. He got me a pillow, got me a blanket. Like, it was not a big deal that I had to sleep on his couch, and so that was very endearing, and very nice. We were living with one of my mom's friends when they first got together, and then we were going to move in with him. And up until that point, we had been living with one of my mom's friends, and I was staying in a room that had previously been an office, so it wasn't even really big enough to be a bedroom. And, I didn't have a ton of privacy. My mom's friend had 3 kids, and they were much younger than me, and we were all just kind of shoved in there because her and my mom had both gotten divorced around the same time, and they both needed financial help. So we were all just like this weird combined family, and there was no, I'd come back from one of my college classes and the kids would be in my room just hanging out. And so it was very it really didn't seem like I had my own space. I spent a lot of time sleeping at my friends' houses, and he had some of his kids still living with him. One of them was my age, and one of the youngest one was still in a high chair. So there wasn't a ton of room in the house proper for me, so he built a separate room into the garage so I'd still have a private space to sleep in, and I remember being really touched by that. A lot of his behavior toward me and around me, I was very endeared by, and I was like, oh, maybe this guy's a really good guy, maybe this is actually gonna work out for her. But then there would be things I remember my mom telling me not long after we went to that concert that she mentioned something to his sister about one of the musicians being really hot, and he got really jealous and was really upset that she said that, and why would you say that, and that's so inappropriate, and I can't believe you do that. And so there were things that like he'd say behind the scenes that would get reported back to me. And so I started to realize that like it wasn't matching up. But then, you know, he built me a bedroom in his garage and like painted one of the walls in chalk paint so I could draw on it with chalk, and like my friends from college would come over and like write notes on the wall and stuff like that. So it was kind of hard for me to even see beyond that, because I was so used to the men that she was with treating me horribly and like just, you know, not liking me one iota. And so to have a guy who like, you know, has been a dad and has been a decent dad, you know, being sort of a dad type to me was, you know, really new, and sort of like, it sort of clouds what you can see at first, because you're just so focused on like, well, he's not drunk and he doesn't seem like a bully. And so, you know, those boxes are marked off. So you're like, well, it must be a pretty good guy then. You know, it really started to feel like, oh, maybe this is going to be something, you know, and my mom did seem happy, you know, at first. And he had a stable job, and, you know, everything seemed sort of, you know, just good. You know, I wasn't really sure fully who he was as a person, but I was also like, I was a teenager. I was, you know, starting college, and I was sort of caught up in my own stuff anyway. So I probably wasn't paying as much attention as maybe I would now. He was sort of kind of, now that I think of it, he was sort of putting on a show. You know, I think he was maybe banking on my mom not talking to me about their relationship, because why would her mom tell her that? Like, I don't think he really understood how close we were. But then there were these times where things would start to creep in, and my mom would start to tell me about stuff where, like, I was still living at home, I think, but I was staying with a friend, and I needed to go to the doctor, and I needed to see someone in Portland, and I was in Vancouver at the time, and I didn't know how to navigate Portland's bus systems very well yet, and so I was like, Mom, can you please just drive me to the doctor? I'm really sorry. Like, I really didn't like to bother her for things, because I wanted to be as, like, adult as I could be. And something I still struggle with to this day. But I was like, please, I just, you know, I don't feel good. I need to see this particular doctor in Portland. And so she was like, yeah, okay, you know, just tell me when and tell me where it is. And so, you know, she goes to pick me up, and she tells me that he was very upset that I was going to be taking time of my mom's away from him. And he was really harping on her. Why do you need to take her to the doctor? She's an adult. She can take herself. Why does she need to take up your time? And that was when I started to be like, well, if he really cared about me the way that he acts like he cares, then wouldn't he be like, oh yeah, I'm sorry that she's not feeling good, you know, tell her I hope she's okay. Like, that would be the more likely response. And so for him to be like, oh, why do you have to take her? That's a red flag. Things like that would crop up again when she and I would spend time together, where, you know, we'd be in her car, and the phone would ring, and she'd go, oh, it's him. And so she'd answer the phone, and he'd be like, where are you going? What are you doing? And she'd be like, I'm going to the mall with my kid, or, you know, we're off going to go on a hike. And he'd be like, well, when are you going to get back? How long are you going to be? And she'd be like, don't worry about it. Like, why does it matter? Like, do you need something? Is there an emergency? Like, as if not, you know, what do you need to be doing this for? And so it devolved into, once cars started having Bluetooth, she would put him on speaker and go, hey, you know, I've got my kid in the car. We're heading off to, you know, do whatever. And he'd go, oh, hey, how you doing? Like, and you could tell there was this thing in his voice where he wasn't prepared to interact with me. And so his initial thing was going to be complaining, and he had to pivot real quick and go into, you know, oh, so excited to be talking to you. This is great. Hope you have a good time. But, you know, really, he wanted to know exactly where my mom was and if she was going to be too long. And, like, it was really frustrating, because it made it really hard to interact with him. Like, you know, I think because initially I thought he was such a cool guy, and I was like, maybe this will actually go somewhere. And so it was really frustrating to see that he was just like all the other guys. But then it was, like, particularly hurtful to me because, you know, he was pretending like he had all this care towards me, but then he was complaining that my mom was spending time with me. So, like, you can't have it both ways. So it made me really distrustful of him. And then, like, the secondary thing was that I didn't like that that's how he was treating my mother. Like, I'd seen her go through all of these relationships with men mistreating her, and here was just one more who was doing the same thing, and now it was also involving me. I, lived in that little garage room for, I think, just a couple of months. And then I started dating a guy and moved in with him way too soon. Whole other story. But I ended up not being there for that long before I sort of, I left and moved in with this guy and sort of started, kind of jumped like feet first into like actually being on my own. And so I wasn't talking to my mom as often, and I wasn't I wasn't seeing her as much. I was living in Portland now, and she was still in the Vancouver area. So it was like, and I was still in school, so I wasn't seeing her as much. And so I wasn't seeing her husband as much either. And I think that was when I started to notice more of the, him sort of being more controlling of her time, because we weren't seeing each other in the same household anymore. So we were making plans to see one another. And that was when it started to be like, she'd get off the phone with him and be like, oh, he was complaining that I'm going out with you tonight or whatever. And so that was when I started to notice that happening more, because we were having to schedule time together rather than me just being in the house. So that was when I was like 19, I moved out. There was a lot of ups and downs, and there would be times where she'd be like, I'm leaving him. And then like a month later, I'd text her and she'd be like, well, let me check with him. And I'd be like, but I thought you guys were broken up. So there was a lot of that where I just kind of didn't know, when she was with him and when she wasn't. It was just after New Year's of either 2014 or 2015, I can't remember. She texted me a picture from their engagement. It was just like a cell phone picture. They had been out celebrating New Year's Eve with friends, and he had proposed. And so I think it was a picture of both of them together, like with the ring and stuff, kind of standard. And her being like, hey, Ryan proposed, we're getting married. And I remember feeling sort of like a here we go again sort of feeling, like I wanted greatly to be happy for her. And at the same time, I was completely unsure of how things were going to go. So it was just sort of, I went, oh, congratulations, love you guys, because that felt easier. I didn't really want to like delve into it too much with her, because I didn't know where things were going. And she seemed happy, and I didn't want to affect that. And so I just kind of was like, hey, great, good for you guys. And then a few months later, in like November of that same year, they went out to the coast, and I went out there, and they had a little tiny wedding in the rain on the balcony of their hotel room, because it was too rainy to go out to the beach. She got a much fancier dress than any of her other dresses had been. Granted, the first one she ever wore was when she was pregnant with me when she got married. So like I have the picture, and it's like a very sad, like early 90s number that had to fit, her 6-month pregnant belly. So like not cute. The second one was in our backyard when we were living in Idaho. And that was like, she had a much more kind of subdued sort of cutesy thing. But then this one was like, it had sequins on it, and it had like a bustier, and it was like, it was like a thing. Like she was really excited about it, and she made her hair all curly and cute. And like, she just, I made her a homemade piece of Shrinky Dink jewelry. Because I was so unsure about this, but I wanted to support her. It's such a weird dynamic to be like, well, you're my mom and I love you and I want to be there for you, even if I don't think you're making the best decision, but I want to put the best foot forward in case this does turn out to be a good thing for you, On the surface, their wedding was like really cute and, had all these fun photos, and we all had a nice time technically, but there was that undercurrent for me of like, technically he didn't want me to be there, which is a not good feeling. Not only did he not want me there, but he like actively tried to get me to not come. They had agreed that it was going to be really small, and so they didn't want the kids to come, because my mom's husband has 4 kids, and 2 of them are pretty small still. And so my mom was like, well, my kid's my only family here. So I would really need her to come. Otherwise, it's just going to be the officiant who's my friend, and then your sisters and your mom. And he was like, well, no kids, though. We agreed, no kids. And she was like, yeah, but my kid is an adult in her 20s. It's not like a little kid you're going to have to wrangle, and everybody else lives out of state. They're not going to be able to come. And so she had to really fight him to get me to even go to the wedding. And which again harkens back to, well, if you like me so much, if you're such a cool dude who's so crazy about your girlfriend's kid, why wouldn't you immediately be like, yeah, babe, of course she can come? Why would you want your future spouse to not have any of their own family there? I didn't even particularly want to go. I just wanted to be there because my mom wanted me there. And it would make me sad if she was, alone. We were definitely not as involved as we used to be because we were both living separately. And at this point, not only was I working my full-time office job, but I hadn't fully put in the notice for the other job I was working in the service industry. So I was working 7 days a week. So I really was not spending a lot of time with anybody who wasn't a coworker for the first couple of months. So we weren't hanging out that often. We were probably texting at least a couple times a week, I would say. But text is sort of, she would get busy at work and she wouldn't reply to me, and then the same thing would happen. And we weren't having big long discussions. It was just it was still during the early novelty of smartphones. So we'd send each other emojis and stuff because it was still fun to do that. And so things weren't terribly deep typically. And then I'd go, because my schedule allowed for it, after I moved out of the service industry and into more office-y things, I was able to actually spend Christmas and New Year's and things like that with her and her husband and his family. On the occasions that we would hang out together, there would be the awkward phone call at the beginning of, well, when are you coming home? And then there would be between when leaving where she picked me up from the transit center or whatever to, wherever we were going to spend the day, that portion of the car ride would be spent with her telling me about all of the annoying things that her husband had done and why she was sick of him. It's not a great way to spend time with your mom. And I still felt this sort of, my dad wasn't great and my mom picked up a lot of the slack. So I felt this sort of obligation to really give it my all with her, even when she maybe didn't deserve it, because using your kid as your therapist is not a cool thing to do. But I was like, well, this is my chance to support the woman who supported me. So it was really just me listening to her being like, this is why he's annoying me. This is why he's failing me, all of these different things. And I would try to be like, well, maybe this and maybe that. And I'm so sorry you're going through that. But then, nothing would happen, or they'd split up for a month or two and then get back together. And it just became a sort of cycle where I could anticipate that at least once a year they'd have some sort of falling out and then they'd continue again. And so really a lot of what I was hearing was just how bad things were. And I would try to get that good stuff out of her and it just wouldn't come because I don't think it was really there. She just told me how frustrated she was with him and, with being a step parent again, which was a whole thing where I don't think she really wanted to be a step parent again. But I think dating in your middle age, you're not going to meet as many people who had kids when they were as young as you were when you had yours. So you're sort of stuck with people who are in the midst of parenting still. And so it just didn't seem like she was happy, and I would try to make the most of our time together. But at the same time, I was dealing with my own relationship stuff and all of these things. And I, not that it would have been my job to fix her stuff, but I really wasn't her therapist. I didn't have the capacity or the background or anything to really put any effort into fixing anything. Not that you can for another person, but I was just sort of listening and trying my best to be helpful. And, at this point, I'm a 22-year-old kid who hasn't been out of college for very long and is, eating beer and pie for dinner. I'm not a stable person who should be giving other humans advice at this point. I should be taking other people's advice. So I think that part of it was just needing a safe space to vent. I think she spent a lot of time with her husband and his family, and she sure wasn't going to complain to, her mother-in-law. And I think that a lot of her coworkers who she was really close to, I think she didn't necessarily want to vent to them because I think she knew that if they heard the same stories over and over, one of them would go, hey, maybe that's not a good relationship to be in. And also they would interact with her husband more than I would. They would all go out to couples dates and go to parties together. And so I think she didn't want to muddy the waters too much with their social life. And so it kind of landed on me. I think that's part of the power dynamic of parents and kids is, I think she knew she wasn't going to get a lot of pushback from me because I didn't see myself on like the same level as her. And so I think she knew that that was a very safe way to sort of vent because like I'm her kid and I love her, but also I'm not going to, react the same way that one of her peers would. But then it got really exhausting to be in that role and to also just hear that my mom didn't seem to have any goodness in her life. And to hear that constantly and to just feel like, like it almost felt like it was my responsibility because she was the one telling me all of this stuff and it felt like she wasn't telling anybody else. Summer of 2019, my mom tells me that she has left her husband and she's living in a friend's rental property until the next family moves in. And I'm like, okay, that's great. I'm really happy for you. Like, she sounds happier. Her voice sounds lighter. She sounds just, there's this thing that would come out every time they'd have a split up where like a separation where I could tell that she sounded just better and she was happier and she had more autonomy and more freedom and she just seemed more like herself. And I would be overjoyed for her, but then I'd get sad because I knew it wasn't going to last very long. But this one felt different. Like she was living in this person's rental property, and then the same person had another rental property that was going to become available right when the next family moved into the one where she was staying. So she was going to rent that one outright. And I helped her move into it. It was a very cute little 1-bedroom. The people she knew lived nearby, and they were like a very sweet couple who like their kids were on the verge of moving out, and they were just... like, I just got the best vibe from them. Like, they'd known my mom for years. They wanted her to be happy and safe in this new place so she could have her new beginning, and they were going to be nearby, so I knew she'd have, like, a support system. And, like, her yard had a beautiful view. It was just, like, I got such good vibes from all of it. Like, I was so happy for her. And so it seemed, like, really cemented. Like, she seemed like she was really holding her ground, and her husband was still, like... he would drive by the rental where she was staying at temporarily and like drive by and she would see his truck and he'd still text her and he'd complain about how like it was harder to take care of his kids without her. She was so happy to be by herself, but I could also tell she was a little bit lonely. I think she was so used to being like a serial monogamist that not having someone was hard for her. And I think there was also this very much air of like, you're not really a successful adult unless you're in a stable monogamous relationship. So the idea of her being single and happy was like a failure of some sort. And so I could see her sort of slipping back in, but she was still living separately from him. And I was trying to like reach out to her more and spend more time with her and telling her how happy I was. And we'd have like little mom-daughter sleepovers. And so like that was really nice, for a couple of months while she was on her own, just kind of living her best life. And it was really lovely. And then, we would go a little while without talking to each other. And, eventually I'd get a text saying something like, well, it's technically our anniversary soon, so we might go do something. And I'm like, don't do that maybe, but I can't stop you. And he would do these things where, he was really bad at like, the consistency that a relationship needs where you're like showing up for each other every day and that kind of a thing. Bad at that. So what he'd do is he'd let things get really bad and then he'd like knight in shining armor it and like do something really grand to make up for it. He was a big gesture kind of guy, because he couldn't handle the day-to-day of like just being in a relationship and like helping your partner with stuff and being supportive and things like that. So he would just kind of let everything slide, and then he'd come out with some sort of big thing. And so, I think I could see her sort of trying to get a little bit drawn in by that. Like, she's a lonely middle-aged woman and she's trying to do her best, but this guy, hey, I paid for us to go do this fun thing, and wouldn't it be nice and romantic? And so eventually, winter is here, and I get a text from her after I haven't heard from her in a while, and she goes, "Hey, Christmas is coming up. I just wanted to know what's on your list, but keep in mind that my budget's a little tight because, Ryan and I are thinking of buying a house." And I'm like, hold the phone. I set my phone down, and I was like, I immediately ran to my partner, and I was like, what the fuck did I just read? What did I just read? And I had to read the text out loud to him, and he's looking at me like he doesn't know what to do either. He's well aware of the whole situation and the history there. And so I'm just, I'm stunned. I don't know what to do, and I don't text her back. How did we get from there, from her spending a whole summer telling me how happy she was to be separated and how terrible he was as a partner, to we are going to make what to me is an even bigger commitment than marriage, which is purchasing a home together. And the other reason this made me unsettled was because her second husband, I don't know the full details because I was 16 when they divorced, but he wasn't great with their money, and he was in charge of the bills, and they owned a home together. And when they got divorced, she had to file for bankruptcy because he had tanked their credit so badly. And so all I saw was that happening again. And I felt like the reason she had not purchased any property with this man, aside from the, fiscal probability of it, because neither of them really made enough money to buy a home, I thought it was because she didn't want to get stuck in that situation again, where, a man could ruin her finances and make it more difficult for her to leave. My initial thought was to just, what I would have loved to have said was run far, run fast. This guy is terrible and I hate him. I wanted to just be really intense and be tell her all of the horrible things I thought about this guy and how much I hated him. But I wanted her to take me seriously. I wanted to have an adult conversation with her about this, and not just have it be sort of I just don't like him, don't do this. I wanted to really lay things out in a way that made her take me seriously. And this was the first time where I was I need to say something explicitly, and I need to, especially because when I would say things well, maybe you could go spend time with grandma and grandpa, or maybe, XYZ thing, it was because she was already complaining and she was already sort of had one foot in the door. So I was trying to just kind of ease her out and let her know that I was there to support her in that decision. And this was the opposite, where she was full bore back into the relationship, and I was hold the phone, don't do this. So that was where this shift sort of happened, where I was not just sort of listening and occasionally making a suggestion. I was in no uncertain terms, I need to sort of rise up to her level and have her see me as a peer, and not just, kind of listen to her complain and go along with it. I need to really make this serious. My dad, he had been dead for a few years. They'd been divorced since I was little, but then he died when I was 23. And it wasn't he was the most stable parent, but he would definitely, there were definitely times where he would be there for me emotionally in a sense that my mom could not. He and I were more of the same person personality-wise, which is another reason why it's kind of difficult with me and my mom sometimes, is because my dad, I've realized this as I've gotten older, which makes the grief harder, that I'm more like my dad than I am like my mom. And so having to, set boundaries with and have difficult discussions with your one remaining parent is really hard, because you're well, that's sort of my foundation of being a person. And you want to feel if you're lucky, you have parents that you can call when something goes wrong. You can call them when you're having a bad day, or if there's an emergency, something. And so that gets more precarious when one of those people is not there anymore. And that was really scary to be like, well, I'm having to say this really difficult thing to her. And I know I have people behind me who love and support me and have assisted me with this, but she's my mom and she's my only mom. And what happens if I am suddenly, at odds with her because I've had to be really honest about these feelings that I'm having. And so that definitely made things, a little more difficult. And it also, I think, made me more likely to be honest with her because, seeing the sort of fragility of life, especially when you're younger and you think your parents are going to live forever, or at least you're watching, TV and somebody's parents don't die till they're 80 or 90. I was sort of thinking about like, well, what does the rest of my mom's life look like if she is stuck in this relationship? Like I pictured her being an old woman with her husband and, not getting the care that she needed because he was, drunk and couldn't drive her to a doctor's appointment or, things along those lines of like, what are my mom's golden years going to look like? Are they going to be golden at all if she's stuck with this guy? And so that really did influence, like, I'm not going to see what my dad's old age was like, but I am hopefully going to see my mom's, and I want it to be good, especially because I saw how bad stuff was growing up for her. Initially, what I did was I talked to two different people. I talked to my mom's adoptive mom, who also did not like my stepdad. And I said, I don't know if you heard, and don't tell her I told you this because she told me not to tell anyone. My mom said, don't tell anyone we're thinking of buying a house. And so I call my grandma and I go, okay, so did you hear about this? I can't remember if she had or not, but either way, she was not happy about it. She did not like the idea of my mom buying a house with this man. She was hoping they were going to separate. So I'm like, I feel obligated to tell her that she's making a mistake. And A, do you think that's a good idea to say that? And B, how do you think I should go about this? And so she was like, I do think you should say something. I think that you're her daughter and you're looking out for her. And I think it's important to say it. And I also don't want her to do it. I think it would be bad for her and she needs to hear it from somebody. Tell her why you don't think it's a good idea and speak from the heart and let her know that you love her. And that's why you're saying this. You're not saying this because you just don't like her husband. You're saying it because you love her and want her happiness and her stability. And so then I went to a good friend of mine who her mom had been in a similar situation, but she'd stayed with the guy until he died. And then once he died, she was like just living her best life, being, going on cruises and just was really happy. And my same friend who I knew that her mom and my mom had been in similar situations, but this friend had also, she's a very no nonsense, good at setting boundaries, good at confrontation, just she's someone I really trust with that sort of stuff. And she's also a mom. And so it was she was someone whose opinion I trusted. So I texted her. I said, hey, can I talk to you real quick? And she said, yeah, what's up? And so I said, my mom texted me last night asking what I want for Christmas, and then was like, money is tight because we might be buying a house. I was under the impression that she was still going to divorce her husband, but now they're buying a house? I know he only convinced her to do it because he knows it'll be harder for her to leave. It's so manipulative, and I want to tell her that, but also, she's a grown woman, and do I have any business getting involved? And my friend said, tell her that. You're allowed to tell her if she's making a poor choice or if you suspect someone is choosing for her. If she doesn't listen, then at least you tried. I would tell her to remember why she wanted a divorce in the first place and ask what he's done to change those reasons. But yeah, you absolutely should be involved. It was a great response. And this is somebody who I'm still good friends with and I adore. But yeah, that really, I was sort of like, okay, I have two people behind me supporting me, and I have sort of a template for how I want to go about this. And so I remember very distinctly, like, I'm standing in my kitchen here right behind me, and whenever I have like a phone call or a text or something I don't want to do, I'm usually pacing in this hallway in my galley kitchen. And so I'm like standing by the refrigerator and I'm staring at my phone. And so I'm like, okay, let's do this. And so what I write to my mom is, I have to be honest with you. The idea of you and him buying a house together really worries me. I can't help but feel like he is trying to get you in a position where it would be harder for you to leave him. It feels manipulative, and I don't trust him. You've told me so many reasons for wanting to divorce him. Has he fixed those things? I know you're an adult, and in the end, the choice is up to you, but I would like you to at least consider these things. It absolutely devastates me to think of you being unhappy and trapped. I spent all last night and all day today thinking about this, so please don't think I'm approaching this lightly. That felt like I was really like, it was very scary and very like adult and, really serious. And it felt like there was a big shift in, how I would normally respond to her and speak with her. And I had to kind of put my big girl pants on, and I felt much more like an adult after that. And I felt like our relationship had shifted a little bit more. I think it took me like, I don't know, maybe like 20, 30 minutes of like going back and like deleting and then adding stuff in and then trying to make sure it sounded good and reading it out loud to myself. And yeah, I may have even, not that I know this for sure, but because I know myself, I probably wrote it down and then typed it out. Like I probably have a note somewhere in one of my many notebooks with it written down, or maybe it's typed out as a draft in an email somewhere. But it took a little while for me to like get it exactly right and say what I wanted to say. That is something that I joke is one of the only things I took away from like my customer service time, was the ability to be really clear and direct. And it's helped me in my current business, but it also definitely influenced the way that I wrote that message out, because I felt like I had a sort of professional grown-up template to use, and then I could insert the heavier, more emotional things, but still have like an ABC sort of, it wasn't just me word vomiting, or, I really wanted to avoid being too angry, because I felt like that wasn't going to get me what I wanted, especially since growing up, I was a very angry kid and my mom, just would call me a brat and move on. And so I didn't want any of that to come through. So there was definitely of like, well, I can take that experience working in customer service and translate it over. I didn't have the read receipts on, so I don't know exactly when she read it. And here's the fun part. I don't have her response. Like the next message down is from like February of 2020 talking about something else. So I don't know if she called me to give me the response because, again, ADHD, or if she texted me and I deleted it because I didn't want to look at it anymore. But I do remember it. I don't remember it word for word, but it was very short. And that was one of the reasons why it upset me so much, because she basically said, like, I appreciate you looking out for me, but I'm not concerned about any of that happening. And then that was it. There wasn't any sort of elaboration. And it felt like she knew that I was right. And if she said anything else, she was gonna start taking to heart what I had said. And she knew deep down that it was a bad choice, but she felt like she had made her decision and couldn't err from it. That was the vibe that I got. I really felt like like this sinking feeling of knowing that our relationship had sort of irrevocably changed after that. I knew that I had really put myself on the line to, do what I could to protect her in a way that I, as like a kid, didn't think that I would have to do for her, at least not until, you picture doing that when your parents are older and maybe you have to make sure that, solicitors aren't stealing their information over the phone. But I didn't picture myself in that protective position at the age that I was in, trying to protect her from, another person in that way. And I felt like I really put myself out there to do that and to be serious with her in a way that I had never been before. And part of me felt like she had really dismissed it and didn't understand how hard it had been for me. But then she also just didn't want to talk about it and didn't want to think about it. And she was going to do whatever she was going to do. Ever since then, she still complains about him. They have not had another separation since then. That was 2019. We're in 2025 now. I go into this mode of, just smiling and nodding, and I don't offer any advice, and I don't really respond, honestly. And I don't know if she's really noticed. I don't know if she's noticed that anything is different in the way that I support her, because I'm not really supporting her anymore. I'm just listening. And before, I was like thinking of, ways that I could help her and, telling her that I would be there to support her if she wanted to separate from him, and she wouldn't be alone because I would be there and her mom would be there and her siblings would be there. And now I just sort of let it happen because it's just going to keep happening, and I can't help her unless she wants the help. And as far as I can tell, she doesn't. She just wants to complain and then go back to it, and I can't do anything about that. And so, I try to ask her questions to still suss out if maybe there is some nice stuff happening, and occasionally I get a cute story, but it's not enough to fill the deficit of, emotional neglect that has occurred in her marriage. It's definitely not enough to make me think that things are good and she's really happy. The advice that people give to people who have a loved one in like an abusive relationship, where they're like, you can't talk them into leaving if they're not ready. So you just have to let them know that you're there. And I do feel like I was doing that for her for a long time. And then, for the last couple of years, there's been some stuff going on with me and her separate from her relationship that has made me, reduce my contact quite a bit, because I've been dealing with some stuff, and part of me feels guilty for having that separation, even though I greatly need it, because I worry that it's making her more likely to stay with him because I'm not an outlet anymore. And so I had to sort of, be like, well, I can't stay in contact the same way for my own mental and emotional health, but I can't be responsible for her well-being. And I tried so hard for so many years that part of me was just really tired of doing it. That repetition of, constantly going, well, I'm here for you, and maybe we do this, and like physically moving her stuff into a new place and then having it all, backslide again. I was just really tired. I do feel bad sometimes that I'm not talking to her as much, because I wonder if that's, making things harder for her to leave if she did want to. But I also know that I can't put that on myself. Like I can't be the only person responsible for that, Yeah, I don't want to hurt my mom, and I love my mom. I adore her. And it doesn't seem like that because I haven't talked to her more than a couple times a year for the last couple of years, and she's starting to ask me if I'm mad at her and things like that. I can only do so much for her, and I have to be okay with that. And I have to accept that there's something in her that I don't think I'll ever understand. And I've learned to start being more okay with that. And that, like, I don't understand why she would rather be with someone who's not nice to her than be happy by herself. I don't think I'll ever fully understand that part of her. And I have to learn to accept that, even though it's really hard, because there's that thing where I'm like, well, maybe if I can just figure out the equation, and being self-employed is, I'm self-employed, and so I understand it a lot more now than I did when I was younger, but, it can be difficult. Rental agencies, don't necessarily want to rent to you because you don't have, your tax documents, and you don't have a pay stub. You just have your own business documents, and things are more difficult. And I get that, I get that that's a scary position to be in, but when it's the only skill that you really have, and, even though she's good at what she does, I'm good at what I do, but sometimes the clients just aren't there. Sometimes, a pandemic hits and everybody has the rug swept out from under them. And so, I think that was a big part of it too, was like I said, this was, December of 2019, she texts me about this. And then March of 2020, everybody's on lockdown and she couldn't really go anywhere if she wanted to. And she, had to stay in the state if she wanted to keep getting unemployment. And I think that first year of real instability for everybody in the world compounded her feeling of instability and probably made it a lot harder to leave. But I think it's something deeper that, somebody who's from a different generation and, somebody who she's gotten more religious lately. And I think that being more heavily involved in the church, that she's involved in, I think that influences things. And it's been decades since I, told her that I wasn't going to be involved in that. And so I don't know what they're telling her every Sunday, and I don't know what her feelings are. And I can't talk to her as like a religious peer about her feelings, and so I have to accept that there's only so much I can do and kind of accept the mystery of not knowing why exactly she's doing this. And that's tough because I want to know, my whole life has been like, if I can just get a handle on this, then I can fix it. And, that's where my anxiety comes from. It's like, well, if I could just control the situation, my anxiety tells me if I just have every single piece of evidence in front of me, I can fix the situation. And I will never have every single piece of evidence in front of me because every person is different. And especially as someone like my mom who doesn't like to dig too deep, she's probably never going to tell me what's deep down in her that's keeping her. She might not even know what it is herself. I am very thankful for the sort of kind of go-getter spirit that I saw in her that applies to me. I just thought it was obvious that people were self-employed sometimes. Partially too because I would go to work with her and see all the people that she worked with who were also self-employed, and they were doing it successfully too. And it was a normal thing for me to know these people who were doing that. She didn't have insurance offered by an employer, and she didn't get a pension or a matched 401k or anything like that. But if I was sick, she would just call up her clients and say, hey, I have to reschedule you for next week. And that was something that I was like, oh, my mom is more available to me than other people's moms are. And that really stuck out to me as one of the benefits of being self-employed, where maybe some of the stability is not there, but then there are other things where it's yeah, you can drop everything. And, I don't recall anybody ever getting really mad at her that she had to reschedule an appointment because her kid was sick. I definitely don't think I would have considered this an option if I had not witnessed her doing that my whole life. And there have been times where I've reached out and I've been like, how do you fire a client? How do you do this? Because I know that you know how to do this. That has been one of the more difficult things about being self-employed, is having to say hard things to clients. And when somebody has done something and I essentially have to stand up for myself and, for my partner, because we work together, I have to do what's right for me, and they can be as upset as they want because it's not really going to influence me, and it's been really difficult to learn how to write those messages and to not let it weigh down on me for days after I send them. And that was definitely one of the first times sending that text to my mom. That was definitely one of the real adult confrontational messages I ever had to send someone. And, now I'm much better at it, definitely. It sort of, on a subconscious level, let me know that I was capable of doing things like that. But my anxiety got really bad over the next couple of years, and I couldn't say anything to anybody without panicking and freaking out. And it's only been in the last year or so, after being in therapy regularly for several years, that I feel like I can have conversations that are of a more confrontational nature. And that conversation kind of has come into play more as like my therapist and I talk about like, well, do you have evidence of when you did the hard thing or you did something successfully? And so I think of that as like a cemented thing where like I formulated the text and I hit send and I did the thing. I love that we're having this conversation because this has been coming up a lot for me in therapy, where I kind of made the decision to distance myself from my mom a bit, and I am now in a place where I want to figure out where it's going. And I think ideally I would love to have a relationship with my mom where I'm not putting in more than one person's amount of effort. I realized that I was sort of doing both jobs in the relationship. I had something really bad happen early on in my self-employment career that I thought was going to tank me. And I texted her because I was panicking and I needed support. And I didn't hear back from her for like a couple of weeks, and she barely acknowledged it and then jumped into asking me a question about something. And then, when her husband texts me happy birthday, if I don't get back to him within like a couple of hours, she's like, he thinks you're mad at him. Can you text him back real quick? So there's like a real uneven level of like effort going on there that, like you said, it gets exhausting. It gets really, really tiring. And there was a long time where I felt obligated to do more work because I thought, well, she put up with me when I was a kid. That was how I really thought of it, was like, well, she put up with all of my nonsense and raising me with such hard work that like I should be there for her, without my own boundaries or standards or anything. And I've had to really realize, that that's not the case, and that, I don't have to pay her back for my childhood. I would love to be in a place where I don't feel responsible for her emotions and for her decisions, not do that thing that I used to do and I'm still working on, where I see her and I immediately want to tell her everything about my life and then I instantly regret it. I really feel like, a big shift in that happened when I sent that text and she was like, oh, I'm not worried about it. And I was like, oh, I don't know if you can really even handle your emotional inner world. So I no longer feel comfortable kind of asking you for input on mine in a way that I used to. I've done a lot of work toward that and like my own boundary setting and, learning what I need. As I mentioned, my dad died and it was because of his alcoholism, and my mom's current husband is a drinker who's constantly in and out of AA, and he's gotten into some nonsense because of it. And so I also just don't want to watch another father type figure person drink themselves to death. And I don't want to see the way that he acts when he's drinking. And I don't want to hear about, the way that he failed, my mom while he was drinking. And that's not something I'm interested in. And so it's hard because I want to have a relationship with her, and I want to, be able to go over to their house and hang out for a little bit and be present. But I also am going to have a hard time doing that if he's got a beer in his hand. And that's not just because of him and my mom's relationship. It's because of my stuff. As I was going through all these text messages trying to find the one so I could read it to you, I was definitely seeing like those moments of joy where like we'd send each other a funny picture, or she'd tell me about something silly that her dog did or something. And so it's like I treasure those moments so much. And I have a relationship with my mom that's not perfect, but like she is very cool, and she is really fun and funny and gorgeous and all of these cool things, but she's also a human. And like, sometimes she doesn't give me what I need, and sometimes she doesn't set her own boundaries or respect other people's. And, I want to be able to balance those things and be like, how do you squeeze that joy out of it? Well, it's work. I have to, figure out how to get there and protect myself in the process. I feel really good about having the chance to tell this story, and At first I thought, well, is there enough there? Like, I sent my mom a text and then she didn't take my advice and that's the end of the story. And having sat down and kind of written through your prompts and like talked through this with you, I'm like, no, there was a lot more there to it. And it has influenced me, more than I have thought about. And it's really important for me to, talk about this stuff, and hopefully someone else hears this and maybe has a difficult conversation that they need to have, or, something to that effect.
Is there enough there? That's a question that came up frequently from different guests that participated in this project that were trying to decide if they had enough of a story to tell. And I'm not gonna lie, every single time that question came up, it broke my heart a little bit, because my answer in every instance is a resounding yes. There is always enough there. It's true that the conceit of this podcast is all about when something big was communicated to us, or we've had to communicate something big to someone else. But the truth is, that's just a vehicle to a larger story. Because without all of the context of what came before and what happened after, that moment is just a satellite alone blinking in the sky. We're not seeing this whole constellation that is really telling the story of who we are, what makes us, why we feel the way that we feel, why we think the way that we think, needs we have that have not been met, what drives us. If we only allow ourselves to tell our stories in pieces, we can start to see ourselves in pieces. So yes, Tessa's very truncated summary of her story at the very end there, that's of course not going to result in any Netflix limited series. That's a blinking satellite in the sky, surrounded by darkness. That does not represent the constellation of the story that we heard. And that includes heartbreak and loss, and it also includes joy and connection and love. That's a whole life. Is there enough there? Substack is really where this project lives, so please join us there. You will find bonus clips, companion pieces, and updates about the show and our guests. I'm choosing to keep this show ad-free, and you can help support that by picking up some merch at howtotellsomeone.com. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen. Just like each of us, this show grows gently and through connection, so please help us spread the word. Share an episode or two with your softest friends and your hardest enemies. See you next time.